When I think about rock music, I keep coming back to the idea that it's more than just a genre. It's something that carries a certain mindset, a certain way of responding to the world. And the more I look at it, the more I realize that rock works almost like a metaphor for pushing back against pressure. Not in a dramatic or rebellious, for show kind way, but in a quieter, more personal sense. The kind of resistance that happens when someone decides they're not going to let the world shape them without thinking for themselves. Rock has always had that energy built into it, even before people tried to define it or break it into subgenres. It already had this sense of refusing to sit still or stay quiet. That's what makes it interesting to reflect on. The way a sound can represent a whole attitude towards life. And when I sit with that idea longer, it becomes clear that rock's power comes from how naturally it mirrors the internal experience of resisting pressure. Most people don't rebel in big dramatic ways. They push back in small personal decisions, in moments where they choose honesty over convenience, authenticity over approval. Rock captures that subtle kind of resistance. It doesn't need to announce itself as rebellious. The rebellion is built into the tone, the texture, the attitude. It's almost like rock gives people permission to acknowledge the parts of themselves that don't fit neatly into expectations. That's why it resonates so deeply. Not because it tells people to fight, but because it reflects the feeling of not wanting to be shaped by outside forces. It becomes a mirror for anyone who's ever felt pressure to be quieter, smaller, or more agreeable than they actually are. Looking back at where rock came from helps make that clearer. The 1950s were a time when everything in America was supposed to look stable and perfect. Families were expected to fit into a certain image, and young people were expected to behave and not question much. But underneath that surface, there was a lot of tension. Teenagers were growing up in a world shaped by adults who had lived through a war and economic hardship, and those adults wanted order and predictability. Young people, though, were starting to feel the limits of that. They wanted room to express themselves, to feel something real, to step outside the expectations that were being placed on them. And right at that moment, new technology was spreading new sounds. Electric guitars, louder amps, radio stations playing music that didn't sound like anything parents approved of. When rock emerged from blues, R&B, gospel, and country, it wasn't just a new sound, it was a new way of thinking about what music could express. What makes this moment even more interesting is how unintentional the shift was. Rock didn't start as a planned cultural revolution. It started as a collision of influences, technologies, and emotions. But because the culture was so tightly controlled, even a small deviation felt huge. The electric guitar wasn't invented to challenge social norms, but once people heard what it could do, it became a symbol of everything that didn't fit into the polished image of the time. The same goes for the rhythms and vocal styles borrowed from black musical traditions. They carried emotional honesty. The mainstream white America wasn't used to wasn't used to comforting. So when teenagers gravitated towards rock, it wasn't just about liking a new sound. It was about finding something that felt real in a world that often felt staged. That's why rock organ matters. They show how the genre can become a metaphor simply by offering people a space where they don't have to pretend. That's why rock connected so strongly with young people. It wasn't polished or polite. It didn't try to fit into the clean, controlled image of the time. It was loud, emotional, and rough around the edges. At us, we reacted to it with fear or anger, calling it dangerous or inappropriate, but that reaction only made it clearer that rock was touching something real. It became a medium for expressing frustration, confusion, excitement, and independence. All the things that didn't fit neatly into the expectations of the 1950s, reflecting on it now, it's easy to see how rock became a symbol of pushing back. Not because it was trying to be rebellious, but because it gave people a way to express what they weren't allowed to say directly. And when you think about it, that's exactly how most meaningful expression works. People didn't always have the language to explain what they are feeling, especially when those feelings go against what they are supposed to feel. Rock filled that gap. It didn't require people to articulate their frustration. It let them feel it. The rough edges of volume, the emotional intensity, are acted as a kind of shorthand for experiences. That didn't fit into a polite conversation, and that's what makes rock such a powerful metaphor. It shows how expression can become a form of resistance simply by being honest. It doesn't need to be polished or strategic. It just needs to be real. That's something people still relate to today, even if the cultural pressures look different. The sound of rock itself reinforces that idea. Distortion is one of the clearest examples. When a guitarist push passes clean limit, the sound wakes up and becomes gritty. That sound is basically a signal refusing to stay within the boundaries it was designed for. It's a small thing, but symbolically, it represents the idea of breaking away from what's expected. The volume of rock does something similar. It doesn't sit quietly in the background. It takes up space. It demands to be heard. In a society that often expects people to be quiet, calm, and controlled, the loudness of rock becomes a statement. Well, becomes a kind of a statement. Not necessarily aggressive, but unapologetic. The more you think about distortion, the more symbolic it becomes. Distortion happens when something is pushed beyond its limit. When a signal becomes too strong to stay clean, that's not just musical effect. It's a metaphor for what happens when people are pushed past the point of pretending. When something reaches the limit, their emotions distort. They stop sounding smooth and control. They become raw, messy, and honest. Rock takes that moment and turns it into art. It says that the breaking point isn't something to hide. It's something to express. The same goes for the volume. Taking up space is often treated like a negative thing, especially for people who are expected to stay quiet or agreeable. But rock flips that idea. It treats volume as a form of presence, a way of saying, I exist and I'm not shrinking myself. That's why the sound matters. It models a kind of confidence that people don't always feel allowed to show. Even when the vocals in rock contribute to this metaphor, rock singers don't usually aim for perfect, polished sound. Their voices crack, strain, and sometimes even break. Instead of hiding emotion, Locke puts it right at the center. That warmness reflects a refusal to pretend everything is fine, or to smooth out the rough parts of life. In a world that constantly pressures people to present themselves perfectly, especially now with social media, Locke's embrace of imperfection feels like a reminder that honesty matters more than appearance, if I'm being dead honest with you guys. And that honesty is part of what makes Locke timeless. Perfection gets boring really fast. It doesn't tell you anything about what someone's actually feeling, but when a voice cracks or trains, it reveals something real. It shows effort, vulnerability, intensity. Things people relate to because they experience them every day. Locke vocals remind us that expression doesn't need to be flawless to be meaningful. In fact, the flaws are often what makes it meaningful. They show that someone is pushing themselves, reaching for something, refusing to hold back. That's why Locke vocals feel so human. They sound like someone trying, not someone performing. The culture around Locke also reinforces this reflective idea of pushing back. Locke has always had a strong DIY element. People formed garage bands, played in basements, recorded on cheap equipment, and didn't wait for approval from the music industry. That attitude, doing things yourselves, even if they're not perfect, is another form of resisting pressure. It's a way of saying that creativity doesn't need permission. Live Locke shows carry that same energy. They're unpredictable, loud, and full of movement. The audience isn't just watching, they are participating. That sense of shared energy reflects on a community built around expression rather than comforty, rather. And the DIY mindset is one of the clearest examples of Locke's metaphorical power. When people decide to create something without waiting for approval, they're pushing back against the idea that creativity needs to be validated by institutions. They're saying that expression has value even when it's imperfect or unpolished. That's a powerful message, especially in a world where people often feel like they need to be experts before they want to do anything. Locke shows that trying is enough. Showing up is enough. 2. Expressing yourself is enough. And that's a form of rebellion that anyone can participate in, even outside of music. So thinking about Locke as a metaphor for pushing back also means looking at how it shaped culture. In the 1960s, Locke became tied to major social movements. It wasn't just background noise. It was part of the way people expressed their frustration with war, inequality, and rigged social norms. Bands like the Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix didn't just make music, they represented a willingness to question authority and imagine something different. That doesn't mean Locke caused those movements, but it gave people a medium that matched the intensity of what they were feeling. And what's interesting is how naturally rock aligned with these movements. It wasn't first. The music already carried the emotional weight people were feeling. The distortion, the volumes, the raw vocals. All of it matched the tension of the movement. Moment. Rock didn't need to change to fit the times. The time changed to match rock. That's why it became such a powerful cultural force. It wasn't telling people what to think. No, instead, it was giving them a space where their thoughts and emotion made sense. It was a medium that could hold frustration, hope, anger, confusion, and possibility all at once. And that's something not many genres can do. So in the 1970s, punk took that idea even further. Punk wasn't about being musically impressive. It was about stripping everything down to the basics and expressing raw emotion without worrying about approval. Bands like the Romans and the Sex Pistols made music that was fast, loud, and intentional, unpolished. Reflecting on punk now, it's clear that it wasn't just a style. It was about a reaction to a world that felt overly controlled and commercialized. Punk showed that anyone can make music even without training or industry support. That idea alone challenged the belief that creativity had to follow certain rules. And punk's influence goes beyond music. It shaped fashion art, design, and even attitudes toward work and authority. The idea that you don't need permission to create, that you can build something from nothing to create, and I had a typo there, my apologies, and that you can build something from nothing is a mindset that still influences people today. Punk made it clear that rebellion doesn't have to be loud or destructive. It can be as simple as refusing to follow rules that don't make any sense. How is that word? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. It can be choosing authenticity over approval. It can be deciding that your voice matters even if it doesn't sound like everyone else's. That's why punk remains such a powerful example of rock metaphorical meaning. By the 1990s, grunge brought back a different kind of pushback. Instead of rebelling against society as a whole, grunge pushed back against the music industry. It's obsession with perfection. Bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam push back. My fault. Let me see where I'm at on the scripts. That's my fault. Just give me a second, folks. Try and see where I'm at. Alright, here we go. Let me just reread that paragraph. My fault. By the 1990s, grunge brought a different kind of pushback. Instead of rebelling against society as a whole, grunge pushed back against the music industry's obsession with perfection. Bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam made music that was messy, emotional, and honest. When Nirvana's Nevermind unexpectedly became a massive hit, it did show people that were tired of overly polished commercial music. A Rolling Stone article described how Nirvana shattered the dominance of polished pop and hair metal, which reflects how strongly people connected with something real and imperfect. That shift wasn't just about sound, it was about what people were feeling at the time. And grunge's impact shows how deeply people crave authenticity. The 80s were full of big hair, big production, a big image. Everything was looking so perfect. But by the 90s, people were exhausted of that. They wanted something that felt honest, even if it was rough. Grunge gave them that. It showed that vulnerability could be powerful, that imperfection could be meaningful, and that honesty could be more compelling than polish. That's why grunge still resonates today. It reflects a kind of emotional truth that people don't always feel comfortable expressing. Even today, rock still carries that reflective sense of pushing back. It might not dominate the charts like it used to, but it still influences the way people think about identity, expression, and authenticity. Rock continues to attract people who feel pressure to fit in or who wants to carve out their own space. It remains a place where imperfection is accepted. The emotion is allowed, and when people can express things that don't fit neatly into everyday life. In a world that other feels overwhelming or confusing, that kind of space matters too. It gives people a way to process what they are feeling without having to pretend. And maybe that's why rock hasn't disappeared. Even if it's not the center of mainstream culture anymore, it doesn't need to be popular to matter. Its influence shows up in attitudes. And by the way, in attitudes and the way people think about authenticity. Rock's legacy isn't about chart positions. No. It's about the mindset it represents. It's about the idea that you don't have to accept every exception placed. You can question things. You can think for yourself. You can express yourself honestly, even if that honesty is messy. That's a message that doesn't go out of style. So when I step back and think about rock as a medium, not just as a sound, it becomes clear why it has lasted so long. Rock gives people a way to reflect on their own experiences and express everything. Well, that might be hard to put into words. It shows that pushing back doesn't always mean fighting and causing conflict. Hell no. Sometimes it just means being honest about who you are. Even when the world tries to shape into something else. That's why rock works so well as a metaphor for revelation. Well, not revelation, rebellion. Not rebellion for the sake of being dramatic, but rebellion the form for staying true to yourself. And maybe that's a real lesson rock offers. That resistance doesn't have to stay loud to be meaningful. It can be quiet, internal, reflective. It can be choosing honesty over the convenience. It can be refusing to shrink yourself. It can be letting your voice crack instead of pretending everything is fine. Rock reminds us, folks, that authenticity is its own form of rebellion. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be quiet. Thank you so much, everybody. I will see you in the next